difference between you guys. There's this Israeli. I don't think he's Israeli actually. He's just a comedian, some Jewish comedian. He talks about the difference between the Sephardic Shabbat Shalom and the Ashkenazi version of Good Shabbos. So he talks about how Sephardic version, it's a command, like it comes from the gut. Shabbat Shalom Alechem Benechem, and your kids and your kids' kids and your grandkids. It's like Shabbat Shalom, mwah, mwah, like intense, And then the Ashkenazi version, Shabbat starts. Good Shabbos. Good Shabbos. How are you? Okay, good. Good Shabbos. It's just so it's super funny. I like him. His name is Modi, Modi. Yeah, you could type in on YouTube Modi Shabbat Shalom, and it'll appear. It's just a short clip, but.
I have things I have to see. I gotta see the kid, the guy he showed there earlier.
Oh yeah, actually, I was gonna watch that tonight. All right. Well, it's 1:45, so I'm gonna go ahead and begin. Are we recording, Dan? Good. Awesome. Well, thank you all for coming, and again, as I said, some of you coming back. It's been quite a journey. So let's just open up in prayer real quick, if you don't mind. Avinu Malkeinu, our Father, our King, thank you, Lord, for God, just another day of your steadfast love that never ceases for us, and your mercies that are renewed for us every morning, sustaining us every day, and restraining so much back from us every day, Lord. And thank you for this Shabbat, and thank you for the rest that we have, especially in Yeshua. Lord, and we just thank you for the message this morning, Lord, and that it truly is you, Yeshua, who does the work in us, the changing, Lord. And I just want to thank you for also this time, Lord. I want to thank you, unworthy as I am, Lord, for just making me a vessel of your word, Lord, and investing your word into me so that I can give it to others and share it to others. And thank you just for letting me carry that, being a vessel in that way, Lord. And really all of us are those vessels, Lord. We should all be admonishing one another with the scriptures and encouraging one another to love and steadfastness, Lord. And Lord, I just pray you would go ahead of us, put your words in my mouth, Lord, and pray for a blessed time of discussion, Lord, and of just digging into your word, Lord, and letting your word go to work in us, Lord, and plowing the ground of our heart, Lord, and just sowing the seed of your truth, Lord, and replacing truth with lies, and even just finding joy in the scriptures and seeing all the parallels and the ways that especially the Torah testifies to Yeshua and to the Gospels. May we behold you as you are, Yeshua, for who you truly are, the King of kings and the Lord of lords, the author and perfecter of our faith. And may this not just be information for our minds to store somewhere in the back, but let it digest into our hearts, Lord, and really become a part of us, Lord. And that is the work that you do. So I just pray for you, Lord, for your Spirit to speak to all of us today. And pray this in Yeshua's name. Amen. Amen. Well, I wasn't going to initially kind of say something because we were live streaming, but I do want to just thank you, first of all, for your prayers. Some of you are new and don't know, but like I started this study a couple months ago, and then just a lot of difficulties happened and took place, and I had to like put it on pause, and it's been quite a journey from there, and the Lord's working in me. So I just want to thank you for your prayers and for, I don't know, just sustaining me through that. I really needed those prayers. It really is a spiritual battle out there, especially for those of us in ministry, and it's easy to get caught up in thinking that the works of our hands is more important than the work of the heart that God does. And he has an order to these things, and I think think I got caught up and burnt out in just doing, and then I wasn't allowing the Lord to minister to my heart. And that's not the way he does things, you know? So, yeah, it's been a journey, and ironically, feel like the things I have been teaching, I've been needing and receiving myself. So, yeah, you know, it's part of the journey, I guess. And I just truly thank you for your prayers, because I know prayer has been so powerful and it has saved me in the past before. So I know the power of prayer, and I just thank God for a community of friends and family and brothers and sisters in Messiah who can be there for each other in that way, you know, and when it's real, you know. So yeah, thank you. So, do you guys have any questions or anything, anything you wanted to say there? No? Okay. So I wanted to pick up on, obviously, because there's been a huge gap, you know, in when we started and now starting up again. I created this new slide for just a review, right? And so we're going to spend a lot of times, and some of you are new, actually, for the first time here. So this will be hopefully a good overview of what we have covered, and hopefully it'll jog your memories. But so far, where we left off really was tracing the kingdom themes, right? The themes that begin technically in Genesis, and we covered a little bit, but really get developed in the books of Samuel, in the book of 1 Samuel, really. And that's where the foundation of the kingdom really, really comes to life. And we really see those themes coming to life there. So we talked about how the first kingdom theme that we can pick up on is that God will choose his king. Remember in Deuteronomy 17, talks about Israel. Actually, let me just go there. Wait. Let's see how far. I don't see the numbers. But Deuteronomy 17 is where God is actually prophesying, or Moses is prophesying, that when Israel, that's not the one, comes into the land, right? And when they cry out, there we go. When they cry out for a king, to be like the other nations, you know, God says, okay, well, fine, you can have your king, basically, but it will be a king whom the Lord your God will choose, okay? That is the ultimate qualification. And so Israel comes into the land, and that's really the first theme that we see. And this phrase really gets to be central to the book of 1 Samuel, okay? This is the book where God goes in search for his king, okay? And this theme is equally central to the Gospels, you know, and it kind of develops there. So God chooses David in Samuel, and then God chooses Yeshua in the Gospels. And he makes his choice of these two Mashiachs, right? We talked about Mashiach, the anointed ones. He makes his choice very clear, okay? And these are the other themes that we will be reviewing of how God went about, you know, making his anointed one clear to the people. So not only does God actually make his choice clear, but moreover, the way that he goes about his decision with David is again echoed and replayed with Yeshua, okay? So these themes actually, they get recycled. I mean, they really get introduced and brought to clear light in the book of Samuel, but then they get recycled and they develop throughout the rest of the Tanakh, and then they get really recycled with Yeshua. And as I said, by the time Yeshua shows up on the scene, the themes are developed even further, as we will see with some examples. So let me actually go back to, which one is it? No, it's not back. Okay. I can't see the slide. I have the slide numbers on my screen, but I don't see the slide numbers here. Oh, there we go. Okay. Okay, so for example, we see these themes recycled, right, and developed even further. For example, we discussed how the events surrounding David and Yeshua's birth are similar. Any of you remember that? The events, the context surrounding David and Yeshua's birth, they are very similar. So, for example, Samuel is the prophet that goes before David, announcing and anointing him as king. And similarly, we have John the Baptist, John the Immerser, who is the prophet that goes before Yeshua. He also gets to announce him and anoint him as the Mashiach, as God's chosen Mashiach, right? How does he announce it? Behold the Lamb of God who takes away the sins of the world. And how does he anoint him? He baptizes him. He immerses him. Okay, so we also explored the theme, the tension between dedication versus desecration. Remember that? And we saw how that theme really applied to the current religious structures and the priesthood that was in place in the days of Samuel and in the days of John the Baptist. Okay, so we compared Hannah's priestly dedication. Remember, she kind of served in a priestly function by just coming into that holy place and pouring her heart out to the Lord. So we compared Hannah's priestly dedication to Eli and his sons' priestly desecration. Remember, Eli and his sons were the priests that were in charge of the holy place in Shiloh there, but they were desecrating God's sacrifices, right? So Hannah, she sacrificially offered God her first and her best, her firstborn son, remember? While Eli's sons, remember, what did they do? Messed up, but how specifically? What were they doing?
They took the first portion.
How did they do? Yes.
With the girls and with women.
Yes, but specifically, they stole the Lord's portion. The first and the best portion that is supposed to be offered in the sacrifice. When people came and sacrificed, they took that for themselves. It was the Lord's portion. Anybody remember what the Lord's portion of a sacrifice was? The fat. The fat, exactly. That was the Lord's portion. And so Eli's sons, they stole the first and the best portion that was reserved for God. So this is huge contrast to Hannah, right? And so what we see with this, desecration versus dedication theme, we saw God switching the priesthood over from Eli's line, from his sons, to Hannah. He gives it to Hannah's line, who is how? Who's the firstborn that she offered? Samuel. So Samuel now becomes the carrier of God's revelations and of his prophecies, his God's true revelation, right? So from here on, so let me mention that this switching of lots, this idea of switching lots, is also to be noted as a messianic theme or a mark that gets introduced, I'm sure it was introduced before the book of Samuel, but it's, again, remember the developments there, the story ripples, right? The parallels, they build and build and build and they develop. Yeah, Linda, you have a question?
Okay, the Aaronic priesthood is still continuing even though Eli and his sons are taken out of it. Does Samuel fall within that?
Did we talk about this last time?
If we did, I forgot.
Could you repeat that?
Whether or not Samuel is in the line of the Aaronic priesthood, we know Eli and his sons were cut out. But there were many priests because Aaron had other sons.
Mm-hmm.
So is Hannah in that line?
I think we did talk about that, but I don't quite remember the discussion. But thankfully, we have a rabbi here. Rabbi? I don't really know. I don't really remember the discussion, Linda, and I'd have to look into that.
Yeah, I'm just curious.
But I remember that there was some discussion about Hannah's husband, who it seems, and I think I remember seeing that like scholars are, that we don't know for sure, but it seems like he does come from a priestly line. So, but I don't quite remember. Yeah. But in any case, the switching of lots is a messianic theme or mark of the kingdom. So again, from then on, Hannah's offspring, Samuel, would be the chosen one to carry God's revelation, his prophecies, and the priestly duties, not Eli's sons. You know, God actually lets them die. So kingdom consequences, right? God honors those who honor him, and he dishonors those who desecrate him. So, okay, so similarly, we saw that theme in the book of Samuel, but similarly in the first century, in Yeshua's day, or before Yeshua's day, God's true revelation, his prophecies, and the true priestly duties would come through John, right? Not the corrupt and compromising religious people who were in charge of the temple in that day. Who were those people? Who was that group? The Sadducees. The Sadducees, because they were sad, you see. But they were corrupt. Remember, we talked about the corruption. We talked about the compromising with the Gentiles, with the Romans. And it goes all the way back from the Hasmonean dynasty, you know. That was just corrupting the line, ultimately usurping the biblical line of Zadok, right? That was the biblical line that was supposed to have charge of the priestly temple duties, but it just got corrupt and corrupt and corrupt. So God did not. He kind of, like we saw that the Sadducees, they acted more in the spirit of Eli's sons, okay? So Samuel and John the Baptist are the true carriers and vessels of God's revelation. Okay, so we're going to be on the slide for a while. So next we looked at Hannah's song, or her prayer, remember? Hannah's prayer actually introduces very specific marks or themes of the coming kingdom or the day of Mashiach, right? The kingdom is also the day of Mashiach. And these marks and these themes are things that the people, the original audience, they can't anticipate, right? They should anticipate, and yeah?
Hannah's husband was Elkanah. Elkanah was from the tribe of Levi.
Oh, yeah?
Okay.
There you go.
Thank you.
Thank you. Yeah, so that actually parallels Samuel and John even more, because remember we talked about how John is likely from the Essenes, right? And the Essenes were the group that, because they knew the corruption and the compromise of the temple, they just cut themselves off and were like, this is wrong, this is not how God wants to do it. So they actually formed their own community, you know, where the Dead Sea, the Qumran, where the Dead Sea Scrolls were found. And they claimed to be like the original priestly line, or to preserve. Their mission was to preserve the original priestly line. So anyways, it just ties them a little bit more. Okay, so when we looked at Hannah's song, we also see these marks or these themes echoed and recycled in Miriam's song and her prayer, Mary, right? We talked about some of Zechariah's song there too. But let's remember that poetry in the historical books, so the history books are books like 1 Samuel, Kings, Chronicles, right? Those are history books. But what did we find at the very beginning of the history book? We find poetry. Is that random? No, not at all. Absolutely not. Remember, these accounts were written so that people could memorize them, right? They had a flow, a strategy to them, because they didn't always have it written on paper or on stones or papyrus and stuff like that. They needed to be memorized. They needed to be stored in the mind. So poetry really helps with that. And poetry in the historical books summarizes the message of that entire book, okay? And it's in the poetry also that where you're going to get these very important themes, and you're supposed to like notice them and pick up on them and then have them in mind as you read the rest of the story and the accounts. So Hannah's song, remember, is the first biblical text to use what term? Does anybody remember? What important term? The first text. Mashiach. Yes. Yes, is the first book that introduces the word Mashiach. And what does Mashiach mean besides Messiah? Anointed one. Anointed, right? So is Yeshua the only anointed one? No. We talked about how David is the anointed one first, right? Before he gets called. He is God's chosen Mashiach, right? Whom the Lord your God will choose. And so we see that specifically in verse 10. And actually, that's Miriam's song. I don't know how far back Hannah's song is. Oh, there it is. Verse 10. This is, Hannah's song really builds to verse 10. This is the climax of the whole poem. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his anointed. And that's the first time we see the word Mashiach. Anointed. So, let me go back. Okay. So one of the first marks or theme, I'm going to use the term mark or theme interchangeably here. One of the first marks of the coming kingdom is God's humbling or scattering of the proud, the mighty, and the taunting, but exalting the feeble and the humble. Okay, we saw that in 1 Samuel 2, in both Hannah's song and in Miriam's. Actually, we see it there. So we also, if you will remember, we compared how this theme, how God humbles the proud, but exalts the feeble, or, the better translation was that the feeble strap on strength. They strap on strength. And we saw how this actually played out first in the context. Let's look at the immediate context. For Hannah, how did this apply specifically for Hannah? Where do we see God humbling the proud and strapping on strength for the feeble in Hannah's story? Who was her rival? The other wife, Peninnah. I don't know if I'm saying that right. Peninnah. How do we see that theme played out between Hannah and Peninnah?
Because Hannah was no longer barren, she was able to have a child.
Yes, and not just any child, the chosen child who would bear God's revelation, right? God multiplied the blessing for her there. But what was Peninnah doing? Why is she kind of the villain?
Harassing her.
She was harassing her. She was taunting her. This idea of taunt, we're going to see this, I don't think it's a theme, it's a motif, this motif of taunting all throughout the book of Samuel, okay? And then we traced this theme specifically between David, his brothers, and King Saul, okay? Anybody want to take a stab at that? How do we see God humbling the proud, the mighty, and exalting the feeble in David's life between his brothers and Saul?
Not only David's life, but also Saul's life.
Yes.
He humbled Saul because now David.
Exactly.
He
Exactly.
humbled David because even though he did things for the Lord, he's exiled.
Yeah. God rejected Saul, right? And he desecrated, right? David dedicated himself, whereas Saul desecrated God's rules, right? He makes the sacrifice. He didn't wait for Samuel. He kind of rejects that, and he dishonors God and desecrates. So, but also we see this theme with God choosing David and not Eliab, his older brother. And we can talk about this more, but his brothers also, if you remember at the battle over there between Israel and Goliath and the Philistines, like, his brothers are kind of like scorning him, like, what do you want to, like, they kind of look down on him. I mean, David wasn't even present when Samuel came, by God's orders to the family. Not even his father thought that it was so preposterous that David, the youngest and the shepherd boy, would be chosen by God, okay? And we'll get into that. Anyway, and then we see this theme of God humbling the proud, the mighty, the taunting, but exalting the feeble and the humble, of course, through Yeshua. and the religious leaders of his day. There were many examples that we talked there, and we'll get into some of that more. So Miriam also says in her song that God has regard for the humble state of his bondservant, and that he scatters the proud in the thoughts of their hearts. So what Hannah says in her song is reflected again in Miriam's song. And just the theme of humility, just the general theme of humility and of God being on the side of the humble is huge when it comes to anything kingdom related. That is huge. It's like the first category, the first requirement, because only the humble can receive the kingdom, right? Didn't Yeshua say, unless you humble yourself like this child, you will never enter into the kingdom? That humility is that first prerequisite of anything kingdom related. Okay? And Yeshua really fulfills this theme of humility because he comes in the greatest and ultimate picture of humility. How does he come? As a man. Okay? Though he was in the form of God, he did not count equality with God a thing to be grasped, but emptied himself by taking on the form of a servant, a bond servant, which we see Hannah talking about, have regard for your servant, and Miriam, the Lord had regard for his bondservant. So he took on the form of a servant, right? And being born in the likeness of men. So Yeshua really, the king, fulfills the theme of humility in the kingdom. He is the ultimate fulfillment. It's a beautiful picture. So another theme that we saw, number 4 here, is that God blesses the barren woman. Okay, this is a strong messianic theme that is actually something that is a sign to the people that they could immediately recognize that God is about to do something big. He is on the move, okay? We really see this with Sarah first, okay? Abraham and Sarah, like God was definitely on the move there, doing something big, okay? The promised son, a whole nation would come from him, you know, and then, but we keep seeing it pop up, you know, and we see that this theme also come to fruition in Hannah, okay? Obviously, she went to the holy place, to Shiloh, pleading God for a husband, and we examined her prayer there and how beautiful it is, and how God, in fact, honored and continues to honor Hannah and her prayer to this day, to the point that even the rabbis in rabbinic Judaism today look to Hannah as the example for how prayer should look like and how every Jew should pray. It's Hannah's example. It's Hannah's role model that they look to. So that's just God multiplying, that blessing, and honoring Hannah in a multiplied way that, you know, she honored him in one way. She gave him, I mean, obviously it's the most important thing that you can give God is your first and your best portion, right? And God will take that and honor it in return and multiply it. Yeah.
Is there a special significance to the concept of barrenness? I mean, we see it in Sarah, we see it in Rachel, we see it in other places. Is there a spiritual message in the concept of barrenness?
Well, I think the message is God is the God of the impossible. You know, and that's one way that he marks himself into the people of that day, where it was a polytheistic culture, right? People went to God, to gods for fertility. They had a god of fertility. They had God of this and God of that, you know, but God marks him. He sets himself aside by saying, look, I can take the weakest, most impossible situation and create wonders, right? I mean, that was the whole point with like Egypt. God demonstrating that he is God because he can take the impossible and make it possible, you know, and I think, but again, you know, there is also a development with this theme of barrenness, that it's a sign that God is on the move and that he's doing something big, and it's really only something he can do. Nobody else can do that. And when you trace the development of that barrenness, you know, you really see it developing to the virgin birth, because it's not just that God, actually, hold on, how did I say it here? because we see this barrenness in Hannah, we see it in Elizabeth, and we talked about that a little bit. But in fact, this theme is developed with Miriam so that it's made even more impossible. God makes it even more impossible. It goes from God blessing barren woman with a child to blessing a virgin with a child. If you thought barrenness was impossible, having a child when you're a virgin is even more impossible, if you could imagine, right? And of course, we can't imagine that. So this barrenness, it really works. Hannah, Sarah, and all these women were significant in the Bible, right? And they produced significant offspring. And so an Israelite in Yeshua's day would have been like, oh my goodness, they all knew that God was doing something big when he gave Zechariah and Elizabeth a child in their old age, reflecting Abraham and Sarah, right? A flashback to them, like, what is this child going to be? He's anointed, he's chosen. God is doing something through him, right? And then, but we see in earlier, even before that, God attaches this sign of the virgin birth to this idea of barrenness, and it just develops even more so that when a virgin now has a child, you will know this is not just another chosen, another anointed Mashiach. It is the ultimate chosen Mashiach, the anointed one. Okay, because there are plenty of Mashiachs that, like we can call Moses a Mashiach, we can call Joshua a Mashiach, David was a Mashiach, right? But how will we know the Mashiach, right? It's not just through barrenness, but through the virgin birth. So it just takes time to trace these themes and really let them, you have to dive into the complexity of it, It's just, yeah. Yeah, Susan.
That's what kind of puzzles me. You hear like in Israel, a rabbi will stand forward and say, I am the Messiah. And how can they claim that, knowing that they haven't come from like you were saying, barrenness has always been a guiding light to celebrating that something new
Right.
has happened.
Yeah.
And for them to erupt and announce themselves, that tells you they're false. They have to,
Yeah.
the Hebrew Bible tells you very specific, it can't underestimate barrenness.
Yeah, you have to follow the themes. You have to, first of all, know and recognize what are these kingdom themes and how they're pointing us and helping us anticipate the Mashiach when he comes, Because when he comes, how are you going to recognize him? It's through all these messianic prophecies, which I'm including poetry, history, narrative. These are all prophetic. It's not just predictions. Oh, the Messiah will be born in Bethlehem. No, it's not just predictions. It's these themes working together and building so that when he comes, you'll be like, oh, it's him. And I know it because the house has already been built this whole time. He doesn't just descend, a house doesn't just descend from heaven. It's being built up. The Old Testament builds, and the completion of that house, you'll see it in the face of Yeshua when he arrives. But you will know it's him because of these themes, because of these marks, because you recognize them and you've anticipated them. And he fits the picture of all the themes, not just some themes come together, all of them are coming together in this one beautiful, coherent harmony, right? That's shalom, by the way. Shalom means harmony, and so it's beautiful.
Yeah, just to pick up on that theme, about O barren woman, there's a place, I think, in the scriptures where it's, in the future, where it's saying, rejoice, O barren woman. And all of these women that were supposedly barren, all of a sudden somebody's carrying their children.
Yeah.
I don't know if I'm interpreting right, but it's just a continuation of his blessings.
Yeah.
As I would see it.
Yes, and these are all themes that I haven't necessarily traced and studied all these themes throughout the Bible. It took me weeks to just do one theme for my seminary paper, in biblical theology class, because there's so much to work through, you know? But you guys, all these themes that, you know, we're talking about, you can go home and, you know, trace them for yourselves. Like if barrenness piques your interest, be like, okay, trace that theme, you know, research it, trace it from Genesis to Revelation. Because, I mean, Revelation talks about a woman, you know, having a child as well, right? And so trace them, you know, and bring that richness to this discussion.
There's one in Isaiah 54, starts off with saying, "O barren one, who did not bear."
Yes, expand the borders of your house and your tent. Yeah. Yeah. Because she will have more children than the one who has children. Anyway, okay, so we see God's blessing the barren woman. That's a strong messianic. And when I say messianic, I also mean kingdom. Messianic means kingdom. It does, because when the Messiah arrives, he is the king. And when the king arrives, the kingdom has come. So, yes. Okay. So next, another theme that we covered is that God's Mashiach would minister to the poor, the needy, and the hungry. Okay? And again, this is a very strong theme in both Hannah and Miriam's songs. Okay? We see it both there very strongly. God will show himself to be on the side of the weak, not the strong, or the mighty, or the self-sufficient, right? And we saw how David did that first, God's Mashiach. How did David do that in his day? How did David minister to the poor, the needy, and the hungry? We meditated on one particular story of somebody in Jonathan's line,
Oh, it fell, the boy fell.
Mephibosheth. Say that 7 times. Mephibosheth, Mephibosheth, Mephibosheth. All right. Yeah, Mephibosheth. Who was Mephibosheth? Yes. Son or grandson? One of those. Was it the son?
The nurse dropped him.
Yes, yeah, and he escaped with his life. But anyway, he was crippled, right? He was crippled, and he was kind of forsaken because Saul died, Jonathan died, and he was fearing that David was after him to kill him, to cut off Jonathan's line, right? But instead, what does David do?
Brings him to his table.
He lavishes on him blessings. He gives him the land. He gives him all the blessings. He wanted to do it for the sake of Jonathan as well, remember? And he just blesses, and he brings him to the table, which is the seat next to the king, right? And so that is the man after God's own heart, okay? He shows himself to be on the side of the weak and not the strong, and mercy. You know, really, we see this idea of mercy being introduced in God's Mashiach. And of course, we saw it with Yeshua. He does this with the suffering people of his day, of course, and we know that those accounts much better, right? And we see actually this theme of being on the side of the weak and not the strong. We see how this theme actually climaxes in the ultimate theme of resurrection from the dead. Death is the ultimate picture of weakness, okay? And the resurrection is the ultimate mark of God's power. Not healing the blind or the sick, or the lame, or even casting out demons, as strong of a powerful mark that is, right? It is the one who resurrects from the dead that is the ultimate sign of God's power, of his kingly, royal, majestic power. So the fact that God raised Yeshua from the dead, after, of course, demonstrating all the other messianic marks and kingdom marks, it just seals Yeshua as God's chosen Mashiach. It absolutely just seals it, okay? Case closed, no discussion, no further discussion. After everything else that Jesus did in his ministry, which are also kingdom related, again, all those things are falling together, and then the final cherry on top is the resurrection of the dead, the ultimate mark of weakness and God's strength. So that's a development from just, going from ministering to the poor, the weak, the needy, the hungry, to ministering to the dead. Okay? Yeah.
Do you have a short version apply. I read some anti-missionary tracts which argue that signs don't mean anything. That, there has to be a revelation to the entire house of Israel in order for the Mashiach to be real. And that all these things that Jesus did, that they don't count because they're just signs. And my question is, how did they go from the signs not mattering, which, Yeshua said, if you don't believe me, at least believe
The works that I do. Mm-hmm.
How do we get from there to the perception that they have that somehow the signs don't matter and that only they kind of Mount Sinai experience?
I'm not going to try to put rhyme and reason to the way they think, because a lot of times they're purposefully trying to distance themselves from any Christian thinking and theology. And we see this actually with the relationship between Judaism and Christianity, especially in the Middle Ages. They're really trying to, both groups, Christians are trying to dissociate from the way the Jewish people practice. They're trying to suppress all the similarities, right? And and that's why Isaiah 53 is never read by the rabbis. They don't even touch it. They don't go near it because it just sounds a little too much like Jesus. And we don't want to be like the Christians, not even at arm's length. We want to build fences and fences upon that to keep people safe away from even considering or having that option in their mind. There is, I don't want to maybe take up too much time on this, but there is also, I don't know if I'll be able to explain this clearly, but there is a safety net within Rabbinic Judaism that says signs don't cut it. And actually we see this in the New Testament as well. If an angel from heaven, Paul says, comes down and preaches to you another gospel, as big of a sign that is, that doesn't give it credibility. It doesn't give the message credibility. I mean, look at Joseph Smith, right? He claims angels came to him, these signs and wonders, when it's not the ultimate mark. It's not, there can be deception in that. There can be, don't fall for it, basically, the rabbis say. And they're right. We see Paul having that same thinking with that same safety net. Signs and wonders don't cut it. But when you have all the signs and wonders coming together from all these themes that develop all the way from Genesis, and then Yeshua comes and steps and fulfills every single one of those, Jesus is not just doing signs randomly. He's performing signs and wonders that the people would have recognized. This is what the Mashiach does. This is what we've been anticipating the whole time for the Mashiach. Making the blind to see, nobody could do that. That's why the crowd got so passionate and why they saw and understood and interpreted Jesus as the Mashiach at that time when he, what did they say? Who can make the blind to see? Who can open the eyes of the blind, right? And can the Mashiach, when he comes, will he do more works than this man has already done? They're thinking he's following in the profile of David. They already had categories of what to anticipate about the son of David, and healing the eyes of the blind. That was an ultimate messianic mark. Nobody did that, and nobody could do that except God's anointed. And then the resurrection of the dead is just it seals it. Absolutely seals it. So it's not just a couple signs and wonders that we're considering. It's all of these kingdom themes and signs and wonders coming together in one person. That is just undeniable. That's testimony upon testimony upon testimony to the 100th power. It really is. So hopefully that answered your question. Okay. So let's move on. Besides resurrection as that ultimate theme of kingdom, right? Another one of these ultimate messianic themes that we also see again in Hannah and Miriam's song is that God will break and defeat his adversaries via his anointed, through his anointed one. Okay? And again, that goes back to 1 Samuel chapter 2, verse 10. The adversaries of the Lord shall be broken to pieces. Against them he will thunder in heaven. The Lord will judge the ends of the earth, and he will give strength to his king and exalt the horn of his Mashiach.
Just a quick question. When he says exalt the horn of his anointing. The horn is mentioned a lot of different places, like the horn at the altar. Do you have an understanding what it means? I don't understand that.
I'm going to give you homework and tell you to trace that theme from Genesis to Revelation. That's a good, because that's not a theme, that's a motif, it's an image, you know? And those also speak volumes of spiritual significance and theology, and those are things to be traced throughout Scripture too. It's not just themes, but images, you know? And yeah, I don't know, Dennis, do you have a word for that? Did you hear the question? Yeah, horns and altars and where we find horns like that, it's
Is the horn like in Sukkot, or is this the horn of a, I mean, you're just saying.
well, the ram's horn, yeah, so I don't know what the Hebrew words are, and I don't know if they're separated, if there's to...
Yeah.
There's a lot of images I learned from kingdoms, different kingdoms, when the horns are spoken
Yeah,
about the different kingdoms. They always use a theme of horns and
yeah. I think it definitely is, just generally speaking, and I don't think I'm wrong to guess this, but it's an image of strength, right, and power. Think of like if it actually is a horn, the ram's horn, like that's the power of a ram, right? And strength, you know, it's a picture. Okay, so Hannah's song really builds on to this verse in verse 10. It is, again, the ultimate messianic theme that we see in the book of Samuel. So first of all, so again, we see this verse going to action. Let me just actually go there so you have a visual. I'm going to go back to it. Did I have it up there? There it is. Okay. Verse 10. That is, it builds, the poetry builds to that. So first we see this verse or this theme go to action again first in David, God's Mashiach, and then in Yeshua we see, right? And we're paralleling just those two right now. So David rid Israel of their greatest enemies, okay? He broke the pieces of who was the scourge, the bane of Israel's existence in David's day. The Philistines. They had such a stronghold since the time of the judges. Nobody could loosen the grip of the Philistines on Israel. They were the scourge of Israel's existence, okay? Everybody hated the Philistines. They were, again, just that long-suffering, just grip. And so when David rids Israel of the Philistines by slaying Goliath, right, the ultimate symbol of the Philistines' power, that was his claim to fame, okay? And moreover, it was the ultimate sign to the people that this was God's chosen king, the one whom the Lord your God will choose. That kind of divine favor, God doesn't give to just anyone. He gives it to his Mashiach, okay? Because again, this is the theme that we're talking about. David fulfilled this verse, right? And in a Hebrew's mind, this verse is kingly. It's only God's king can do that. Okay, so likewise, we see the son of David, Yeshua, also defeating the greatest enemies, right? And we talked about sin, death, and Satan. Ultimately, we talked about the spiritual enemies in the heavenly places. But actually, we didn't talk about this, so this is new information. There is another more concrete enemy in Yeshua's day that he dealt with, okay? And the way that Yeshua dealt with it would have served as a major, again, cherry on top sign to anybody who had ears to hear and eyes to see. It would have served as a huge sign that he was indeed the, capital T, Mashiach, right? God's chosen Mashiach. Now, I can think about this for a minute, but let's think like a first century Jewish man and woman, okay? If you were living in at the time, who was your giant enemy? Exactly. Rome. And finally we go to the next. Oh, no, I forgot. Okay. Yes, Rome. Oh my goodness. The proud, mighty, and taunting Romans, okay? Rome was the Goliath of the first century, and every Jewish person knew it, okay? And actually, for a Jewish mindset, the Romans served as an image for all Gentiles, okay? After all Gentiles were enemies to Israel, historically, and certainly in the first century. And that was their mindset. Gentiles are the enemy. Don't be like the nations, right? So how did Yeshua walk in the footsteps of David in this way? And how did he slay this giant scourge of Israel's existence in his day? Does anybody want to take a stab? And not many are running to this because you know what the rabbis say. Yes.
I don't know if this is true or not, but I read someplace that David took the head of Goliath and carried it back to the Garden of Gethsemane, where the Messiah is coming back. The Garden of Gethsemane.
Wait, say that again. That David took the head of, yeah.
He took the head of Goliath and
Mhm.
brought it back as evidence that he has conquered the Philistines.
Yeah.
Brought the head back to where the king is coming back. When the Messiah returns, his foot is going back to
Mount Olives.
Gethsemane. Anyway, I don't know if it's true or not.
How does this have to do with how Yeshua defeated the Roman Empire? Or...
I'm just picking up on the.
Oh, okay. Sorry, I'm just trying to make all sorts of connections in my mind, and I don't think they're working.
By resurrecting, like when they were trying to, like with putting soldiers so that nothing would that happened and they could not hold.
Oh, with the tomb being burst open despite the Roman guard that was there. It's not the ultimate mark. It's not that. Ching, what did you have to say?
I was just gonna say, at some point, didn't he receive acknowledgement from like the Roman leaders that he was Messiah? Yeah.
Well, I wouldn't say Pilate confessed.
Okay.
Pilate questioned, and he was open to hearing. And well, yeah, but I mean, he says, "What I have written, and I'm not going to change it." But there's no like textual evidence. It's not. I mean, I think that gets closer, I think, to the answer, but it's not quite.
Or could it be the subversion of Rome?
What do you
Paul
mean?
did that. Well, Paul was a Roman citizen. He used the laws of Rome to expand the gospel. And in many ways, because the Romans were great architects and road builders and everything, that very activity that they took such pride in was used to expand the gospel. Maybe that's one.
Expand the
Slow.
gospel. You're closer. Warmer. Susan.
I mean, it's totally the resurrection, because the Antichrist will try to resurrect himself to show I'm dead, and the ultimate defeat over death is what Antichrist is going to try to convince people that he is the truth.
So that's Yeshua conquering the ultimate spiritual enemies in the heavenly places, right? And we did talk about that. He conquered God's enemies, right? Satan, okay? He conquered the evil bloodline that went all the way to Genesis 6 with the Nephilim, and all the spiritual forces in the heavenly places. I'm talking about something more concrete. Like, if you were a Jewish person in the first century, you just want Rome off your back. You want that captivity. You expect the Mashiach to slay the Goliath of his day.
He would be the king and not the suffering servant, is what you're saying.
No, I'm not saying that. No, I'm saying, how did Yeshua slay Rome in the first century? How did he? Yeah.
So I was thinking about some of the things that even Yeshua itself, like when it came to like paying taxes, where it says, give to Caesar what is Caesar's, give to God what is God's. And even
Okay.
him claiming, to Pilate, of course, that my kingdom is not of this world. If it was,
Right.
then my followers, would follow me. But also for the fact that just the way he lived his life, and he started having all of these followers, that in one sense would be considered disrupting the way that Rome was having.
It did disrupt. Keep going with that.
Yes.
Keep going. After the resurrection, how did it disrupt?
Because
Because it was the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. God and not the multiple gods that Rome was, Rome was.
But what did it do to Rome? What did the gospel do to Rome?
It changed the way they lived. It
Yes.
started them, there was a spiritual battle, just like you said. There was a conflict in the way they lived in Rome, and then they were being taught of this Israeli way. It was an inner conflict. The change started slowly erupting where we call it, they started eventually becoming what they call Christianity. But it was a change, a small change, but eventually it blossomed into a flower.
It got rid of the.
But what did that do to Rome?
Got rid of the false gods.
Go centuries back, more into history, guys. Think of Paul. What did Paul do? Let me give you a hint. Let me give you just a small hint, because I did have it here. I'm sorry. No, I kind of like this. I just wanted to keep going. Let's remember that Yeshua is not only like his forefathers. He comes in the shadow and in the picture of his forefathers like Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and David, right? But he's not just like them. He is better than them. He is greater than them, okay? He is the better Moses, the greater Joshua, and the greater David. So if Yeshua had merely just killed the Romans and freed Israel from Roman captivity like everybody was dying for him to do, including his own disciples, right? He certainly would have been just like David, but just like David. So now, I don't know whose hand was up first. Go ahead.
What else I was gonna say was just the fact of how instead of being like David or being like anyone else before, he laid down his life. He was the one that showed them a different way to even treat their enemies compared to what was being.
Show who? His disciples?
He showed all the people. He showed Rome, and it was talked about how Rome would crumble down the line. Rome was
Okay.
going to
Can somebody just say it like,
Rome was a picture of the world at that time.
Yes.
He took down
guys, he conquered Rome. The gospel conquered the Roman Empire. So that even later, what empire is the next one that arises after Rome? The Byzantine Empire, right? Not right. So,
the same thing that happened in Egypt.
okay. Well, not quite, but
He conquered
but he didn't bring the Egyptians into the family.
It changed the world off because a lot of the teaching at that time was he made people look at it, made people think. It started that got people.
It started.
Yeah.
Moses. Okay, so Yeshua comes in the picture of Moses too, in that. Okay, you have this clash of like God and the other Elohim, the gods of Egypt, right? But then there's separation, right? Moses takes his people and they become a nation, and Egypt is still Egypt. They're separate nations at that time, right? So as great as Moses did, as the mighty wonders that God did through him, Yeshua was even a better Moses and a better David. Yeshua didn't conquer with that force, right? He conquered with the gospel. So Yeshua was the greater and better David. And instead of annihilating the Romans, like David slew the Goliath and just killed him, right? He conquered them with the gospel, with the good news itself. An entire empire from such a small nobody. Think about it. Yeshua wasn't nobody. He didn't have status. He didn't have power. He didn't belong to the Pharisees or the scribe or the Sadducees, right? That whole list that we saw, right? He didn't have servants, but he was called master and all that. But he still conquered an entire empire with the gospel. And at a time when everybody was just dying for the Messiah to rise up and do what David did, including his own disciples, as we said, Yeshua does more than David could and better than David ever could, right? Imagine if David was just like, hey guys, Philistines, instead of killing you, I'm going to bring you into, like, why don't you just be grafted into Israel? He didn't do that. Nobody did that. Moses couldn't do that. David couldn't do that. Only Yeshua, when he steps on the scene, he is the one who brings all the nations back in. We talked about the reinheritance of the nations. That is another huge theme that, again, only the Messiah could do, only the King could do, because God promised to the Son in Psalm 2, I will give you the nations as your inheritance. That is better than what David did. David would have just slain, killed Rome and killed off all the Gentile nations, right? Yeshua doesn't do that. He is better. He conquers them with the gospel. He conquers them spiritually. And so in doing this, Yeshua fulfilled, as we said, the messianic kingly prophecies that would invite Gentiles into the family again. That reconciliation, that reunion, which again is a huge, huge kingdom theme. It's like at the very top with resurrection up there. And it is, guys, it was a sign by which Jewish people can and should recognize the King, the one that God has chosen to be Mashiach, because he will perform these signs through that anointed one that nobody else could do, okay? So again, I already mentioned in the famous messianic Psalm 2, God says to the King, God says to the Son, to the King whom he chose, I will make the nations your inheritance. And also James, okay, let's talk about this a little bit, because James, or Jacob, right, the rabbi in the Jerusalem church in Acts 15, hopefully you remember, when they're having this discussion, they're having this debate on, listen, guys, the Holy Spirit just fell on the Gentiles. What are we to do with this? I don't even know how to think about this, right? They're having this discussion. Should they become Jewish? Should they become circumcised? Right? Some were divided and all that. And so James rises up and he says, he quotes Amos 9:11, which says, in that day, I will restore the fallen house of David. I will repair its damaged walls. From the ruins, I will rebuild it and restore it to its former glory. And Israel, listen to this, Israel will possess what is left of Edom and all the nations that I have called to be mine. And the Lord has spoken, he will do these things. So Edom, they were ancient enemies, okay? Edom actually means red, right? Who else is called red? Right, exactly. Edom is Esau, or rather the descendants of Esau, the brother of Jacob, right? Now, Esau and Jacob, we saw, they went in two opposite directions, completely opposite. Even though they both came from Isaac, they went in two opposite directions. One became the chosen nation, the other became disinherited because he forfeited his birthright, okay? Just like the nations, we heard in the Drash today, the nations forfeited their inheritance and became disinherited. And so God's like, okay, Abraham, I'm going to create a whole new nation out of you, and you're going to be the chosen one. So Esau was rejected, disinherited, Jacob was chosen. So Edom is in the same category with the other nations, enemies of Israel, but who were, again, first disinherited before they became enemies. So again, that main messianic kingdom theme or mark is that God will defeat his adversaries via his anointed. Well, I would say that the greatest way to defeat your enemies is not by slaying them, but by conquering them as family. Not just friends, family. Love your enemies. Yeshua came preaching. That is the ultimate sign of being a son and daughter of the Most High God. When you love your enemies. Why is it the ultimate mark? Because it is the kingdom. You've arrived. You've arrived. You're in the kingdom. When you can do that, when you can love your enemies. And that is what the king does. He reclaims the nations and reinherits what was once lost and disinherited. That is the message. Loving your enemies is the message of the King of Kings. Okay? And he is the first to do that. Again, in his day, nobody accomplished. I don't think we can even conceive the magnitude of what it meant for a first century Jew to think Gentiles are on equal footing with us. They're family? What? It was so scandalous that it literally, that is what the rabbis and the Pharisees and everybody who opposed Yeshua and the disciples and the early church, that's what they were opposing. They didn't want the Gentiles coming in. It wasn't so much Jesus' teachings. It wasn't, his miracles and his wonders. They would have listened to that had he not had a greater vision for the Gentiles to come into the nations, okay? That's how confusing and corrupt his day was, Yeshua's day was, that the Jewish people, Israel, lost sight of all these messianic kingdom things about the Gentiles, God re-inheriting the Gentiles, and they completely lost their mission, because that was Israel's mission. They were to be a light to the nations, a city on a hill, a covenant given to the people of the nations. That was their mission, and they totally lost sight of that in Yeshua's day, so that they couldn't recognize him as the king who does that, who is given the nations as his inheritance. Linda.
Where does the anti-Semitism come from? I mean, finally, the world gets the message, and then all of a sudden, they don't like the source of the message.
So that's like further down the road. Anti-Semitism actually started with anti-Judaism, which developed in the first early church. But before we go there, I really do want us to see how, even though the empire that follows the Roman Empire, right? Somebody said Rome crumbles, right? But spiritually, the Gentiles make Christianity the power of that day, and that empire becomes the Byzantine Empire. Okay, so this is Christian rule now. Okay, and the Gentiles are the ones mainly doing this. I'm not saying they did it perfectly. I'm not saying, but still to trace and to be able to see wow, one message did this to a whole empire. It changed the course of history altogether. It was a huge milestone. And that is prophecy fulfilled. To be able to just focus on that despite the anti-Judaism, despite the divisions and all the problems that came out, in the church and the problems with the Jewish community and the Christian community following, still, that was such a milestone in history for the power of the gospel to do that, what was the wisdom of Gamaliel? If this thing is not from God, it will fall and crumble. Do you know how easy it is for things to fall and crumble? How many tasks do you get done every week that you plan to do, right? How hard is it to make something successful unless God is doing it, unless God is behind it? And if this is of God, you will not be able to overcome it. And guess what? The gospel was not able to be overcome despite all the persecution from both the Romans, the Gentiles, the Greeks, and from within the house of Israel, right? It was an insider's message, but it became for the outsiders too. And despite all the forces coming against the gospel to snuff it out and to just silence it, it couldn't. It was from God. And I just want us to be able to sit in that and dwell on the power of the gospel to conquer an empire that used force. It was the Romans are known for their force. They were like the Philistines in that way. So much force, right? But the gospel comes with a whole nother force that conquered that. And I think that's just that is a better David. That is such a much better way, so I just think it's so incredible to be able to see that. And yes, there are problems down the road. Yes, the Christians and the Jews and the Messianics, really, and the earliest Messianics, the Jewish believers in the early church, there's so many problems that develop and so much tension and friction. And of course, you have the Gentiles overpopulating the Jewish believers, and they're coming in with their own worldview. They're coming with Greek thinking. They're coming with philosophical thinking, and they pour that into Christianity. They really do. And then you have what's called the parting of the ways between Judaism and Christianity. When Christianity really solidifies itself as a separate religion, it wants to separate itself from Judaism. And Judaism, right, wanted to separate itself from the Christianity that was forming. And then, of course, Christianity gains the political power, and that's bad news for the Jewish people. But the persecution was on both ends. The Jewish people were persecuting the early Christians, the early believers. They were the ones really. So I don't know if any of you are familiar with Polycarp. Polycarp was a Jewish believer. Amazing story. He was a martyr because his own Jewish brothers turned him in for still practicing the Jewish feasts and Passover and keeping these things that were now outlawed by the Christian.
Constantine?
Yes, it is under Constantine. So Polycarp was actually a disciple of John, I believe. Like he was, right?
He was earlier than that.
He was earlier than Constantine. Okay. I don't have all my historical facts, but I know that he was martyred because he was turned in, and he was, when somebody tells on you, right? Like he was betrayed by Jewish people because Jewish people were at that time trying to, and the early Christians, they didn't have that political power that actually Jewish people had. Jewish people had permission to worship their God and not give tithes to the emperor, right? That had been long established. There was a deal between the Romans and the Jewish people in that day, but the early Christians didn't have that. So they were martyred, they were slaughtered, they were turned in by their own. And then the tables kind of reverse. Christians get the power, and then they start persecuting the Jewish people, and it just gets messy. It really gets messy, and it becomes first, the division starts with anti-Judaism. It starts theologically. You Christ killers, that was the main accusation made against the Jewish community. They killed Christ, right? They totally forgot that Jesus resurrected from the dead and that was supposed to happen. But nevertheless, they use they slander, and there's all sorts of development. And eventually, by the time that you get to, I think it's the Middle Ages, it turns into anti-Semitism because, if I'm remembering my history correctly, I'm kind of just going off from what I remember. When Jewish people started, actually, there was a point in history where Jewish people were converting to Christianity. But they were still, even that wouldn't give them political power and the human rights and the civil rights that wasn't enough for the Christians. They still suspected these Jewish believers, and they were called conversos, whatever. So despite the theological, getting on the same page theologically, despite that, it really used to really see the shift from anti-Judaism to anti-Semitism, because now it's no longer about theological differences. It's about your identity. You're just Jewish, and that's you can't get out of that. That's a disadvantage that you are stuck with, and you can't get out of that. And it's just a judgment based on their ethnic, because they're Semites. Anti-Semitism comes from Semitic, right? And Semitic actually comes from the name Shem, right? They're the descendants of Noah's son Shem. And so it just becomes anti-Semitic at that point in the church and in political spheres and all that. So that's where you see really a shift from theological reasons. Oh, Christ killers, you kill, all that, and blood libels, and it gets horrific, absolutely horrific and messy. Yeah, well, it's 3:00, so we're. It is 3:00. But I do want us to just we talked about. We already went through this discussion, and I was going to skip this slide. So not next week, but the following week, because it's going to be every other week, we're going to go into David and Goliath. We're going to reread it. This is also some review. I'm not sure how many of you remember this, but we're going to talk about some flashbacks and foreshadowings of this story, because this is a huge messianic story. It's not a children's story, all right? So let's get that out of our minds. It is not a children's story whatsoever. It is a messianic narrative prophecy, okay? It is very powerful, and we're going to dive into it. Yeah. So does somebody want to, or any questions before we have 2 minutes? Questions, comments, observations? I'm looking at you, Linda. She's got all the questions. Yeah, Susan.
Dennis said today that it was interesting that with the Conservative Party where that would happen, because it's really the Messianic community saying, love thy neighbor as thyself.
Yeah.
Throw them out, and then the evil one can come in and try to destroy that nation. Because it is really that presence of loving your neighbor, that self-destruction of
Yeah.
not loving your neighbor, that would be a tremendous risk, for final destruction that Revelation's talking.
Yeah, that's a very wow kind of observation that really is, because I mean, we just saw how the gospel conquered the Roman Empire. It can conquer Israel again, right? It can and it will conquer Israel, the nation of Israel that we know today. So the story's not over. Yeah. Does somebody want to maybe close us in prayer? Anybody else? Yeah? Go ahead. Thank you, Gary.
Gracious Heavenly Father, we thank you again for this Sabbath day that you've given us. We thank you for your instructions throughout the day and this instructions about the kingdom to come. May we ponder over it, research it all the more in our hearts, and be ready for the next lesson. We pray in Yeshua's name. Amen.
Yeah, and I encourage you to just do some research on your own. If you have any themes or images or motifs that you want to trace, and then come and share it with the group. That'd be great. It'd save me a lot of research.
Thank you.